Hello and welcome to the SaaS Growth Podcast. This week we're here with Ludovic Dubost, the founder and CEO of XWiki, an open source wiki platform that's just celebrated its 20th anniversary. How are you today, Ludovic?
Hi, Carl. I'm very good. I'm very happy to be there and talk with you about XWiki and open source.
Thank you so much for being here. Can you give us a rundown of XWiki and how it came to be?
So this is a long time ago. So XWiki is like more than 20 years now. So initially, I was a user of wikis in my previous companies, and I used the wiki to help organize my team. And at some point, when I left that company, I felt I was at the stage where I could create something, and I was very motivated to create a software in the knowledge space or in the knowledge management space. And that's how I decided to create a new wiki. Initially, I thought I would more like maybe commercialize open source wiki platforms that I was using. I was using Twiki at the time. So this was in 2003, 2004. But I thought the software had technical limitation, that it would be difficult to push it to companies in order to fund it. And so I decided to write my own software and then released it in 2004 and started to find people that would use it, companies that would use it, try to find a business model around it and make it an actual real company.
So I'm going to go into this. You made the choice to make the software open source, which must make it very difficult to create a monetized business around. So how did you go about tackling that and the problems that open source can bring to profitability?
First, I wouldn't say that it makes it difficult to do business because actually it is open source has its challenges when it comes to funding and grow the business. But actually, when you start, it's a good way to start. That is actually quite cheap on capital. XWiki SIS has never raised any outside money from investors. We grew based on the money we made with our clients. And at the start, what we did is we did some service with clients that wanted to improve the initial platform. I had some money on my side, so I cannot say that I started with absolutely zero money because I had some time in front of me. I had some money from leaving my prior job, and I had a bit of time in front of me. So I used that time to actually bring the software to a level that it would be usable and it would start interest people. But then the initial funding was really about one customer bringing funding to improve the platform to another, doing some service. The challenge with open source is actually when you want to be a real software company, you want to get a little bit out of that service model and you want to go to a more regular model. And for that, it's a bit more challenging. You need to not be too naive about open source. The fact that you shouldn't think that everything should be free and you need to have a real offer around the software to make sure that you can sustain it. But XWiki is a company that has grown all the time, has been profitable all the time. We took some money from employees in order to have a little bit more cash, mostly not to fund the company, but more to fund the cash flow. Because when you grow a company, you also have to handle some cash issues because you're growing. But XWiki has always been profitable from a business point of view.
What other challenges does open source bring as a business model? So you said that you had challenges moving to that software side of things. And how difficult was that in finding the right way of presenting XWiki that you could sell it as software rather than the service?
Yeah. So first, maybe one difference that you can get with traditional companies or proprietary companies can be a bit in some partnerships are a bit more difficult. For example, it's going to be more difficult to do partnership with service companies if you do on premise or with cloud companies, and this is a bit what creates a lot of fuss in the open source world between some companies where you have these that service or the cloud companies that are hosting the software and the software company that builds the software, and you don't really know who's going to get the most money or where it's going to go through. So our approach to it was to say that we wouldn't rely too much on these partnerships and we would build our own SaaS. So we decided to build our own SaaS, and we also decided to have good offers. One of the challenges is that initially things are free. So customers tend to think that everything's free. From my point of view, it's important for the open source companies to educate customers about how it works. But my view is that the competition that you can get with people that could use your software instead of you is actually, if you get that to that level, it means your company works well. Most companies that have this issue with other companies, like using the open source software and trying to make money instead of the company that actually created it, are stories of companies that actually are already doing quite some revenue. You won't see that too much from companies that are not making revenue, because the problem for smaller companies is not whether somebody's going to steal your software or not. The problem is actually make a place in a world where there is a lot of software and you get to get known. And this is where open source actually helps you a lot. So if you think about making business with open source, you need to embrace the open source model, and you need to use open source as a way to get known, as a way to get customers that's going to love your software, and your community is going to help you and is going to reduce your cost of marketing and of sales. This is what's happening at XWiki. XWiki SAS is a company that doesn't have a huge cost of sales. We work mostly with incoming calls. People call us to do business with us. We don't call that many companies. Now, one challenge is more that this whole model can be difficult to make compatible with what venture capitalists expect. And this is why the biggest decision that we took for the story of XWiki is to uh, forget about venture capitalists and raising money, because we thought what we wanted to do, be independent and do something with the community, for the community, that is sustainable, was actually not compatible with what venture capitalists expect in terms of level of growth. I think that venture capitalists expect a multiplicator on the revenue that is indeed difficult to get if you want to stay with an ethical business model. Most issues are with that level of multiplicator that some of open source companies that started as open source want to achieve to please their investors. We don't have that problem, and therefore we have more problem about, okay, can we invest more, finding investment, because you need to make money to invest, which is not what traditional software company do. They raise capital to invest, they don't find clients to invest. We need to have success with clients so that we can do better for the next clients. And that's the biggest challenge, but it's something that takes more time, but it works.
So is that almost trial by fire side of things where your software has to work, otherwise you can't grow?
I think this is true for all open source software. I think open source is a great way to validate whether your software had a chance or not. It's really difficult to cheat with open source. Actually, the way some open source companies cheat is that they, like many of the startups, proprietary ones, is that they don't make money. So if you have investors and you're not making money, indeed, you can cheat. You can have free users. So you have not in with a smaller company like ours, not only the software has to work, but the revenue has to work. And you have to find revenue. If you don't find revenue, you will get difficult. Now, it would be wrong to say that we haven't found any funding. We also got funding from research subsidies in France. So Europe has great ways to get funding. You can get funding through research projects. You can also find clients that have strategic reasons to go to open source. And this is also something that we do. So we do have some external funding, but it's not a funding that will require us to do 5x or 10x in the future, and that will require us to change our business model.
Yeah, I've worked for open source companies in the past, and those sorts of grants, they're very valuable, very good resource for anyone who can claim them. So that's
Yeah,
makes
but
sense.
this is a bit specific to Europe, but in the US, you also have public funding. It's just different ones. In Europe, you have pretty open research calls that you can participate to. You can also work with research agencies to work together and make proposals. This is also for us a great way to do R&D. Even now that the company is a bit more established and has regular revenue from clients, it's still a great way to achieve innovation. For example, this is how we go towards AI, and we got some funding and we're working on new user interfaces for XWiki. And this is how we created our second software, CryptPad, which we created 8 years ago, but it was created out of research projects. So these innovation projects are also ways to innovate and keep up to date in R&D for things that the client might not be funding directly.
Just looping back a bit, you did mention ethical business practices and you running an ethical business at XWiki. So what does that mean to you, and how important is it about how you go about running your business?
Yeah. So one thing we didn't really talk about first is why do open source also? Because you can do open source just because it's a good business model or you feel well with the business model but we also do open source because we think it's an important thing to do. Open source from my point of view is what will give also individuals uh, sovereignty. Not only sovereignty of countries, but also sovereignties of individuals. So I'm concerned with that. I'm very concerned with the fact that we don't control software, that we're really in the hands of really very large companies that control everything. In Europe, the problem is going to be even bigger because not only we have big companies controlling us, but they don't even come from our continent. And so we're even in the hands of foreign countries. And so if we don't necessarily agree, we could face issues. So this sovereignty issue is something that I find important, and so for us, it was important to participate to it. And I believe, in our company, we believe that open source is a great way to achieve higher sovereignty, both for countries, but also for individuals. So individuals can access the code, they can see what's in there, and they can also decide to run their own software. So that's what one reason. Ethical is not only that; it's also ethical business practices and also being a good boss. So when I created the company, I also thought about what I would want to see as an employee in the company. So when I was in prior companies, and I worked in some large companies before, I also worked at Netscape. If that still reminds something of your listeners, like young people will not even know what Netscape is, but it was a big company in the internet space, and these were pretty larger companies. And I was not always happy about the way management was working and what employees would get out of it. So when I decided to create a company, I also thought what I would expect what I would want what my employees would want from me, and try to be that. And that means being fair internally with the employees, being having a company that's transparent. So the open source values at XWiki, they go beyond what we do in the open source world. They also go into how we do things internally, trying to be extremely transparent with all the employees, and also publish how things work inside our company so that everybody can understand the decisions that I'm making as a CEO for the future of the company. And then ethical extends beyond and being ethical with your customers. Another thing that I like with open source is the relationship that you get with your clients, which is not always easy, which is less in the favor of the software company. But in the end, if you do things right, you can build real partnership with your customers. You need to work with customers that will respect you. As a software company, you will have less power, but the customers are going to also help you because they have an interest that the software works well. And you will give them through open source more guarantees that you're going to behave better. If you don't behave well in the open source world, your work can be forked and your customer can go away. Customers are not fully forced to stay with you. They have some reasons that doesn't fully make it easy to switch. Software is quite sticky in general. It's not easy for companies to get out of software. But in open source, companies have less lock in than the proprietary software companies will have. And this is also an ethical business practice, which keeps us honest as a company.
Exactly right. So they can just copy the code and start running it themselves if they get like
Yeah,
completely screwed by
which is
you or
not
whatever.
that easy. So
No,
it
it's
can
not.
also
But
become very costly. So customers do have good reasons. If you're a good business partner and if your price is right, they don't have big reasons to go away from you. Now, price in the software world is something that's extremely complex because when you discuss with people about what too expensive is, or it's often like it's more expensive than it was. The absolute what the right absolute cost of software is very difficult to define. It's really about the competition, and that's maybe one other aspect of the learnings we had through the 20 years of open source. That it's a lot about competition. It's in the end, there are some moments where things are better because your competitors are less performant or they decide to increase their prices. And we lived that at XWiki, with Atlassian having raised their prices in a way that, from my personal opinion, is not a great ethical practice. Now they're free to decide for their own business what is right and wrong. What I know is that for our business, it's been good, because when customers don't like too much when you're pushing changes on them that don't seem right. They will look for alternatives, and we have had the chance that they also come to open source, and they came to us as alternatives.
I can definitely say from the consumer side, like when places raise prices, it can feel like because of the closed doors, you don't actually know the financials. They often come at you with, oh, the world's expensive now, so we need to raise our prices. But then as a consumer, you see they posted record profits that year, and you're like, did you? Like, you've raised the price on a service I've been paying for years, but I don't see the need for it. But I
Yeah,
suppose in open source in your company, with your transparency, it helps a lot with those discussions and showing where you are.
yeah, practically, our customers can also understand the need for investment. Now, the thing is, and this is also the reason some companies raise their prices. They don't raise their prices necessarily because they need to invest in the software they're building. They want to invest in some new software that they can sell and increase and then expand their business. And so customers with XWiki, they do see that we do need to invest more in the software, that is going to be useful to invest in the software, but they will question whether this investment will be useful for them. So we have to be right about that and make sure that we invest in the interest of our customers. And if we don't, and that's not going to be okay. And when we raise the prices, we need to explain. And I had a lot of discussions with some clients about how we factored in inflation and so on in the way that we increase the prices. These discussions never happen in the proprietary software world with larger companies, because customers have zero control. They cannot even say their voice. The only thing they can do is go away,
What is-
because the decision is going to be pretty much
and
unilateral.
as you said, software's sticky too. So usually the choice is eat it. You just got to take the price increase, and then it's getting away is too expensive. Like,
Yeah, yeah, but it's a short-term bet also. For the company, you might make more money short term. For over the long term, you might also pay the price. This is actually one of the challenges in the open source world too. You need to think about how much you spread your software as open source. So, and what are the services that you sell? So for example, when you decide that some features will be paying, you need to think about whether or not they will slow down your spreading, because if you spread less, then you're going to be less known, and that is going to reduce your customer base. So you have to think about that as an open source company too. And now, one thing that we did as an open source company is that when we decided to do paying modules, we decided that the code itself would stay open source, because there is actually nothing in the open source licenses that says that you cannot sell open source code. If you want, you can do it. It's just that since the code is open source, some people could decide to rebuild it themselves and distribute it. But we found that it didn't happen in our case. And our customers are buying code that actually is open source. They're just buying the package ready to go in their instance of XWiki. And that was actually quite important with larger companies, because in larger companies, if something can be free, then managers will tend to say, okay, let's take it free. So you need also to give a good reasons for the customers to actually buy the software instead of just using it for free.
do you have examples in the open source community of underhanded practices people do, especially when they go to monetization? Because I've definitely seen like, let's call it partial open source, where they release a small part of the application, but nowhere near enough to actually compete with them. Things like that.
The change of license is for me the biggest problem. Then there is open core, which is has been a traditional way to monetize. I don't think it's the right thing to do, because it will at some point companies will tend to reduce the open source part of their code, and open source is something I believe is important. The thing is, the companies don't necessarily always believe that. They do open source because it's a good way to start a business, and then they decide to move away. But we don't want to do that. We want to fund the company to make more open source. So the goal is to be able to make more open source. So open core, from my point of view, is not the right solution to have that objective. It might be the right solution to make more revenue, but I don't see it as a great way to create more open source. Then the change of licenses, I think, is the biggest problem that I've seen. Some companies, and you've seen that with Elasticsearch, for example, or Redis. So they have expanded a bit the users of the software to a bit the maximum they could get. And at some point, they say, okay, now we cannot get more growth from growing the number of users. How can we get more financial growth by increasing the monetization? And at some point, they realize that there is a bunch of participants to the community that actually also make some money, or, for example, the cloud providers and so on, that were quite useful for them to expand the community. But then it goes in the way of growing more. I don't think it's right. So I think it's okay if you decide that your license should not be purely open source. If you want a license that is the source is shared, but you cannot use it for business, you cannot use it for cloud. Why not? But from my point of view, you should do it right from the beginning. If you want that business, if you want that approach to your code, if you want to do business source license, which is delayed open source, you should do it at the beginning. Because from my point of view, it's not where it's not ethical is that you're luring a bunch of participants to your community that you're actually doing something very open. And this is not a correct business practice. You could extend that beyond open source, like OpenAI, which started as a nonprofit and got a lot of people were talking about it as, oh, look, they're going to advance the state of AI by publishing research and so on. And now that the business is actually working well, they don't publish any research anymore. And the open in OpenAI doesn't mean anything anymore. And so the switch, these type of switches where you actually renounce the way you interacted with your community is something that I don't feel is right in the business practices. You could say the same thing with what's happening in the WordPress world. I do like very much what WordPress has done an incredible job in open source, but you could also say the same thing coming 20 years after growing the WordPress community and saying that now the brand is going to be a key point in the way you're going to be allowed to do business around WordPress is a change that is a bit, maybe that's the right thing they need to do, but they should have done it at the beginning and not 20 years after. I think it's really creating a lot of problems in the way you're interacting with your community.
But
We
yeah, it totally makes sense.
will not do that.
Yeah. It does make sense that you've set this tone of interaction, this tone of openness. So you've had like an MIT or GPL license, and then all of a sudden, pull the wool out. You can't do it anymore. Like you've been using the software, you've invested in the software, and then they change it on you. So you can, yeah.
Yeah, like you have some companies that have seen that this license is this way. Now the thing is, as a user of open source, you also need to be careful. We are careful in our usage of open source that we look at the licenses and we don't get fooled by the level of involvement some companies will have in the future. You can't. There is one thing that you shouldn't expect from open source companies is that it's not because they're giving you their work that they should continue to give it. So that's also another way of looking at things is that you're giving the source as it is today. You don't necessarily have to give it to give your future development. So you could also decide to change what you do in the future. I think it still causes a problem when you're running a business and you're launching a software that is sticky. You need also to give some visibility to your clients. So we wouldn't want to change the way we've done open source, and we want to give stability to our clients. But you also have a lot of users of open source that just expect that because you've been giving it for free, you should continue to do that, or that you should fix their bugs. You find an open source library on the internet and you find bugs and you say, "Oh, your software is not good. You should fix the bug in the software." No, fix it yourself. If you like that open source code and you want it fixed, pay to get it fixed or fix it yourself. That's something a lot of open source developers live in, including companies. I had a lot of interactions in the 20 years of XWiki with people that just tell you they expect your software to do this and to do that. I say, yeah, sure. It's pretty simple. If you can expect it as much as you want, if you really want it to happen, invest in the software. And that's a bit it's a method that is tricky as a company because you're still bringing a software and you're still wanting to provide a business around that software. You always want to talk very well about your software. My software does all these feature and it's up to the perfect level. It's doing all of this, and you have a lot of customers that ask you, does your software do this? Does your software do that? Etc. And so you want to answer positively to that because you know that they might drop you if you say that you don't have it. And so that's tricky to keep the balance between advertising your software and at the same time telling to your customer that at any time, if they want to put a little check to make the software better because they think it's really important for them, they can do it. And that means you're going to tell your customers that your software is not perfect.
Yeah. When people are contributing their own little bits of code to the core application, does that cause problems? I want to say too many cooks is a good example. So there's too many visions coming in. How do you maintain the sort of core vision of the software and make sure that's preserved with
So
so many
first,
different
in,
contributors?
in many companies that build collaborative software, such as ours, you don't have that many contributors. You have people that give you their opinion. You have people that report bugs. You have people that might send you a patch, but you don't have that many individuals that come and want to do a big feature. However, the problem that you're telling still exists because we do have customers that ask us to develop stuff. So we might have development that will go either in the core or as extension that come from customer requesting it. And you get this difficulty of going too much the way of custom. So your software is supposed to be one software for everybody. And at the same time, you will have the pressure from customers to direct the software to their specific needs. And that's actually a big difficulty for any company that does open source or that use service as a way to develop the software, is that you need to try to create some unity, and you might have to either refuse a feature or just say that they're going to stay as a custom feature. So they're going to be put as an extension or outside an extension. They're not going to be put as going in the core. I think that one solution to that problem is good modularity and the ability to replace modules in the core. XWiki is a quite customizable software, but we do keep our core very clean in a sense that we have a development team that is going to be difficult about whether or not something goes in the core or in the core feature set. And then we're going to have extensions, and then we're going to have customizations for customers. Now, keeping a modular platform is not something that's easy. It does create difficulty. It is more difficult than having one software running on a SaaS on the cloud. Everybody gets the same software. It is definitely more easy to do that type of business from a technical point of view. But we believe that this is in our space, this is not really what our customers need. We believe that for knowledge management, the customization level is actually quite important because knowledge is companies have very different ways of working, and you also need the software to adapt to these ways of working. And this is something that we're able to achieve with XWiki, and this is something that our customers do like about XWiki, the ability to adapt to their own workflows and their way of working.
One of the weaknesses of modularity and adaptability is the fact that customers then have to adapt the software, right? So it's very difficult to take a software that's meant to be adapted and use it off the shelf. So how does XWiki deal with that, especially when new people are trying to join the platform?
So the biggest difficulty with adaptive software or with customizable software is upgrades. So it's coming later. It's not necessarily coming right away. But right away, you also have what you say. So, but wikis have always been like that. When you put a wiki in a company, it's a bit like a white sheet of paper for a writer. You have the writer's problem of, oh, what should I write on my paper? And a wiki starting empty is always more difficult for every company. So you need companies to have a bit of a thinking about how they're going to start their wiki. You can't really start a wiki from scratch that easily. Maybe you can do it in a technical team, or maybe you can do it if you have one very motivated employee in the company that will start that wiki for the others. but you will have that difficulty. And in 20 years, this is a difficulty that we faced with a lot of our customers. They didn't know that much about wikis. For some of them, they were interested in wikis. So, oh, how do I launch a wiki? But they didn't really understand what they need to do on their side to make it happen. So what we did a lot with them is try to ask them what corpus of data do they already have that has value for their knowledge. And we try to see with them how we can bootstrap a wiki space with that content. So trying to import some data in the wiki, trying to organize it, so to pre-organize it so that they can have a wiki that doesn't start empty. And when the wiki doesn't start empty, employees that use it, that see it, they start to see the value and then they're more keen to collaborate. And they're knowing that in lots of companies, making people collaborate is sometimes an issue. Some startups are very collaborative with people that are very young. They want to collaborate. Everything's new. You want to share. Most traditional companies and companies that have been there for a long time, they're quite structured. They are hard to move, and you need often a lot of change management to make wikis successful. So you need to show the results. For example, you're going to work with one team so that you can show the results for one team. So this is things that we've done a lot in the past. And this has always been a challenge for wikis to be more successful in companies because people, if they don't know wikis, they need to learn how to use them. That has always been an issue in our space.
Thankfully, Wikipedia is a thing now, so everyone's got some experience with our wiki. But
Yeah. At Wikipedia, it gives them the value aspect. They don't
mostly with
necessarily
contribute.
see the behind the scene aspect
Mm.
of collaboration. And so you also need to show how the tool is going to help collaboration and how it's going to allow the content to grow. But this is something that needs to happen in almost every company in order to make the company more collaborative. My feeling is that wikis help to make companies more collaborative.
They definitely do. And I know a lot of companies struggle with that exact thing. They want to start documenting, or they want to start recording. Got a lot of information just in people's heads and they want to write it down. But a lot of places also struggle to get to that collaborative state of a wiki or any sort of document base. So I'm curious as to if you've got any tips for companies to help that sort of collaboration. And you've bootstrapped a little bit of content, but then making sure it stays up to date, and whether or not it's better for a wiki to be more focused in one area or for it to be as wide as possible.
We give a bit all possibilities to companies because sometimes the companies have very different sizes. So it's really difficult to exactly say how things should work. It's always a question, should you do a huge wiki for the whole company or should you do wikis by sub teams? I think that you can do wikis by teams and because wikis still allow interlinking between the teams. So you can have team of a certain size by a business area, for example, they can have a space and they can link to the other space of the other team. You should not have too many silos. Silos is a real problem. So you shouldn't have 10,000 of wikis inside a company. It's going to create a lot of problems. You need to think about what's common in your knowledge. My company size, which is we're 65 right now at XWiki, we like to have wikis by team. So we have about 10 wikis, let's say, by either a team or a subject area, like a wiki for marketing, a wiki for products, a wiki for the salespeople. And this gives each team a bit of independence so that they can build their own space, which makes them very comfortable in their space. I think it's important that the team is comfortable in the space that they have. Now, if you extend this to a very large company and you say 10 wikis for 65 people, then you might get to 10,000 of wiki, and that's not going to be a good solution. So you need to find a way in order to do that. We've seen some companies, we know Amazon is using XWiki, and they choose to have only one wiki. They have one huge wiki, and then teams have their space in it. So it's just one gigantic tree, but your tree is also, you still have a tree of data, and the space of a team is going to be one branch of that tree. So you can still have the notion of team inside your gigantic wiki. The difficulty when wikis get really big is, where do you put your content? Should it go in the team? Should it go in a knowledge base about a specific subject, etc.? Now, this is actually the problem of all knowledge in general is where should we put the content? Is it in the right tool? Is it in the right space? What's great with Wiki is that even if it's not in the right space, it can still be linked back from the other space to that space. And that's really, for me, how wikis really are more performant than other tools when it comes to knowledge. You have a real difficulty to link properly to data that's going to be in the chat or to documents. They're going to be really hard to read. In wikis, your document is going to be much more easy to read. It's going to be smaller, and you can link back from one space to another to be able to create pages about a specific subject and point to all the relevant information that you have in the company.
I imagine the case of Amazon too. Like you talk about the one wiki. I can imagine there being at least a team that's dedicated to XWiki, dedicated to managing it and curating it a little bit.
I don't know if they curate it. What we know is that when we started working with them, it was in 2015. Their team was almost bigger than our team of core developers that was working on. They were migrating their wiki from MediaWiki to XWiki, and they had a bigger team than our core team just working on that project. But I think they don't mix the technical people from the curation. I think it's really hard to have a curator that would be global to the company. And it's probably not a good approach to the problem. I think what you need to do with wikis inside companies is you need to motivate each team to do their own curation of their space. So it's more about how much you involve, how much each team gets a little bit of time to manage their content. You can also do the curation as you go. It's like refactoring in development. Like you do a new feature and at the same time you're going to improve another area. And I think this is the way we do it with our own wikis, is that you always, and this is something you should always do with knowledge management. And this is why it's really important that knowledge management is handled as part of the workflow so that you're using the wiki in your work. You're going to put data in the wiki that you need for the current work that you're doing. And at the same time, you're going to improve the organization for the future. The companies that are trying to create wikis as something external to the tools that they use for working, they will never get the time to actually build a wiki. They will always use the time to actually do the work that they have to do right now. This is the whole thing about short term and long term. What I try to do to say when I say about wikis is wikis are a good balance between short term and long term, efficient for doing work every day and efficient to make that work, that to make the knowledge more usable in the future. And this is why wikis are interesting for knowledge management from my point of view.
I can definitely see if people aren't using the wiki as their main tool, like it ends up lagging behind, right? And this happens a lot in code all the time where people are writing code and documentation is lagging and therefore it's out of date and therefore it's not very valuable. So you have this tool that no one uses because no one updates it.
Yeah. Developers are trying to bring the documentation inside the code, which is interesting, but it also has its problem. What we did for documentation is that developers are not allowed to get the feature out if they don't create the documentation page that goes with it. And so you have to do it when you're doing the development. But it's always a challenge because you have a very tight deadline and you want to reach the deadline. And let's say the less important thing is going to go away and it's going to be the documentation or the quality. The feature is going to come out, whatever happens. And that's a real challenge for quality in general.
I'm of the opinion that the developer is actually one of the worst people to write the technical documentation for a feature they've just written.
Yeah, that's also true. That's also true. But this allows our developers, in our case, what we try to do is we want developers that understand what they're coding. We don't like too much the segmentation between the people that decide how the feature should work and the developers. So our developers are very involved in designing the feature and they should also be involved in the documentation. But it's indeed a challenge. It's a challenge that your documentation risk being more technical than user oriented. And that's actually you need two types of documentation. You need the technical documentation and you also need the user documentation. One way to look at that is, and this is actually something you can do with wikis, you can have your developer writing the documentation, and you can hire documentation people that come behind and improve the documentation. And because in the end, it's a collaboration. You will need the documentation to be accurate technically, and you will need your documentation to also be understandable by end users that are not technical. So you need a bit both point of view in your documentation, and so you need the collaboration between different types of people there.
Mm. Let's really look back a bit onto the idea of short term inside of a wiki, because it's not something I've particularly experienced before. Like I've only ever seen more evergreen content inside of wikis. So, how would a wiki be used for something like a short term project, and especially archiving once the project's done? How do you then manage that information?
No, but I didn't really mean short term in that sense. I didn't mean about content that you will not need in the future. I was more thinking about the fact you need a tool that's going to be efficient to collaborate on the needs that you have when you create the content. So when people, for example, when people work together, they need to produce some documents, or they need to produce a work plan, or they need to produce not a blog article. So you will look for tools that have real-time editing, comments, annotations in order to make it efficient that work together on the content. These are the short-term features I talk about. And for example, Google Docs has been a tool that has allowed a lot of progress in producing documents together. CryptPad is a tool like that too. We have real-time editing in CryptPad, and it's extremely practical to take notes. You create notes. Yeah, this is extremely efficient. The problem is that your document is just there. It's sitting nowhere in the organization of your content, and it's not there to evolve in the future. So it can evolve in the future, but nobody knows where it is anymore. And wikis will give you will attach the document to there, but wikis also need to include these real-time features, annotation features, macros.
Right.
So wikis usually have macros that, for example, Google Docs doesn't have. And you might need these macros to present some content in for short-term collaboration. For example, one way where wiki pages can be really interesting is you create a page to organize an event, and you have a checklist about everything you need to do for events. This is something that we've been doing for the last 15 years at XWiki. We create an event page. It has a checklist that is that has been created with the experience of the previous events. And we have a checklist directly in the wiki page, and you can actually check directly in your wiki page that you've done the task. And so you have a mix of document and task list. This is a feature that is inherently short term. This is a feature that you need in order to manage the organization of your events. But you also need the page about the events, how much you paid for that events, how much it cost, because this is knowledge that's going to be extremely useful in the future to organize new events, or it might be useful to employees. If people in your team leave, this information will get lost because oh, look, we went to that event 5 years ago. But it's not the same people that organized that event. And so the wiki is going to be extremely useful over the long term to capture that knowledge and make sure that we don't do the same mistakes.
We're about to run out of time, so thank you so much for coming. Is there anything you'd want to still talk about just in the last few minutes? Anything you'd
Yeah, there is one thing we didn't talk about. We didn't talk too much about CryptPad, which is another type of software, and maybe that connects also to the ethical aspect. Is that I mentioned that we created CryptPad as a research project, and we actually in the research project we were working on real time editing, and what happened is that our developer read the algorithm for real time editing in a way that would allow to drop the server in as a tool to synchronize the edits of different people. And at that time, we realized that this would allow end-to-end encryption. And this is how we decided that CryptPad could be a different product, providing end-to-end encryption. And it could also give a solution for better privacy. And this is what we've done with CryptPad. And this is why it's a different product than XWiki. It's product that its main focus is providing collaborative tool that protect people's privacy. And this is a tool that people can use on the internet. You can even test it on CryptPad. Very easy to use, and On the server, you can't read the data that people are editing. And for us, it's a response to a large problem of watching people's data everywhere on the internet and
When you mentioned
end-to-end
Google Docs, right?
encryption.
You
Yeah.
mentioned Google Docs, and one of their
Well,
privacy things is they get to run
Google Docs,
AI. They get to
but
read
not
your
only
stuff.
like you have lots of problems around the fact that everything you type on the internet can actually be read somewhere. And end-to-end encryption is a key technology that's quite important to protect people's privacy. And with CryptPad, we're bringing this to document editing and give people a better tool that guarantees that they're not going to be watched.
Great. That sounds like an excellent tool. I've definitely seen notes that are encrypted, but I've never seen real-time collaboration that's been encrypted like that. So
Yeah, you
that's
can store. It's quite easy. It's not so difficult to take a document, encrypt it, and store it somewhere encrypted. You have a lot of tools that do that. But the what you need in order to do real time editing and end to end encryption is quite complicated.
again. Thanks so much for coming. So this is Ludovic Dubost. Where can people find you, Ludovic?
Or they can find me on the internet. You can find me on Mastodon, on LinkedIn. Usually my account is L Dubost. And if they want to find me physically, they would need to come to Paris in France.
I don't want to encourage people to start hunting you down in Paris.
Yeah, but it's a nice place to come. So if they come, they can always come and reach out.
Well, again, thanks for coming. And for everyone else, we'll see you next week.